Hello, welcome to the second lecture of week 5. In the last class, we discussed the origins of Indian English poetry, and in fact, we said that from the next class, during the next class, we would begin with a discussion of Nissim Ezekiel. Nevertheless, we choose to call this class Arun, Kolatkar and the Bombay Circle of Poets for a significant reason. Why is it called Arun, Kolatkar and the Bombay Circle of Poets? We will discuss in a short while. But before that, continuing our discussion, taking up from where we left, let's begin with a discussion of Nissim Ezekiel and his contribution to Indian English poetry. Of course, at this juncture, you may quickly recall 1952, and we have already identified that year as a significant year as far as Indian English poetry is concerned, because that's the first major poetry collection, a couple of years after independence, that a first major poetry collection comes out, Indian English poetry collection comes out in 1952. And broadly speaking, Nissim Ezekiel, he creates a broad template for modern Indian English poetry to work out its details. So that's the reason why we call Nissim Ezekiel the father of modern Indian English poetry. He was a professor of English at the University of Bombay. Therefore, he had access to the best of poetry written across the globe. Generally speaking, it is said that his own poetry is greatly influenced by the poetry of Ezra Pound, a major symbolist poet, and of course T.S. Eliot. So they act as his poetic gurus. You can call them his poetic gurus. Okay. Well, keeping in line with the ethos of post-independence India, his poetry comes to chalk out the ambiguities, the kind of confusion that existed in governance, in way of life, because obviously when there is such kind of a great epochal transition, India attained independence in 1947. So the entire land was coming to terms with the new sensibility, the new way of governance, the new realities, all these things. So it's a kind of a transition phase. So any transition phase has its own states of confusion, states of ambiguity, states of adjustment period. So his poetry describes all these things, loneliness, creativity, petty politics, more than all these things, banality of life. Because see, remember, for over 100 years, there was a kind of an epic struggle that defined Indian way of life, until 1947. The India's struggle for independence gave an epic identity for people, because it was in their collective pursuit after independence, it gave them an identity. But now that identity has been reached, now that India has attained independence, people need to carve out fresh identities, right? They need to carve out fresh identities. Now all of a sudden, that the nationalistic consciousness that pervaded the entire continent, now having achieved its purpose, now it's witnessing a period of lull. It's in a period of lull. So during that period of lull, people find the entire life quite banal. So his poetry expresses that banality of life in a brilliant way. Especially, his poetry is very well known for, using Indian English in a very creative way. Please remember, of course, by then English had become part of Indian life. 1835, we already, we have identified 1835 as a landmark year, because Macaulay's Minutes on Indian Education, English Education in India. And it's been more than a century since English has been introduced as a medium of instruction here. So as a result of which, of course, a class of citizens have been formed, wherein in in color and complexion and blood they are Indians, but in terms of sensibility, in terms of language, they are English. That's the purpose of that's the one of the primary reasons behind Macaulay's introduction of English education in India. So as a result of that, people begin using English in their own way, in a creative way. So Nissim Ezekiel uses this particular English to bring out the banality of life in a very brilliant way. Before we discuss some of his poems, here are his important collections. In fact, he has more than 10 poetry collections to his credit, beginning with Time to Change. In fact, the title itself is symptomatic of the changed realities of the country in which he has begun writing in 1952. This changed reality, it's a time of change and all that. Afterwards, 60 poems, The Discovery of India, and in fact, Hymns to Darkness is a very significant contribution. In fact, it's it brought a lot of fame to the writer, Hymns in Darkness, and of course later in 89 his collected poems comes out. So this is a kind of a brief bio, a poetic profile of Nissim Ezekiel. So from here, let's move on to understanding his poetry. Of course, remember, when we discuss any poem like this, it's not that this is a representative poem of the writer. It would be injustice to reduce our discussion of a poet to just a poem. But despite its limitations, in order to have a first-hand understanding of Nissim Ezekiel's poetry or anybody's poetry, we need to pick up at least one or two poems and discuss. So you can call them just illustrative, not a kind of a representative one. So in this beautiful poem, Nissim Ezekiel compares a poet, lover and bird watcher. And of course, you can recall Shakespeare doing something similar in his some other work. He compares poet, a lover and a lunatic, poet, lover and a lunatic. But here he compares poet, lover and a bird watcher. Again, see, of course, he also champions free verse. He champions free verse and establishes it as a kind of a, until then, Aurobindo in Savitri and many of his other works preferred using blank verse. So with Nissim Ezekiel begins the era of free verse in Indian English poetry. So this poem too. To force the pace and never to be still is not the way of those who study birds or women. The best poets wait for words. The best poets wait for words. The hunt is not an exercise of will, but patient love relaxing on a hill, to note the movement of a timid wing, until the one who knows that she is loved no longer waits, but risks surrendering. In this, the poet finds his moral proved, who never spoke before his spirit moved. The poem goes on, establishing common grounds for comparing poet, lover and bird watcher, and how patience is a virtue in all the cases. How you can't force your time on when you're about to go watch birds. You can't force your time. Similarly, you can't force your will. And so is the poet. He can't force his way into poetry. He has to wait, or she has to wait patiently. The Patriot is a poem. Of course, earlier I was discussing the usage of Indian English, in poetry. So just look at it. Look at a couple of lines. I'm standing for peace and non-violence. Why world is fighting? Look at the use of refrain. Of course, it's a characteristic feature of many of our Indian languages. Many of our bhashas. Unfortunately, when many of us speak English, we try to imitate the language patterns of our first language, even in English. They may sound un-English, well, they definitely sound un-English. Nevertheless, as a medium of our expression, they are capable of conveying our sensibilities. That's why, you can notice the use of continuous tense, and use of refrain, fighting, fighting, I am standing. It's not that the person is actually standing. Instead of using simple present, we keep using present continuous tense. Of course, using the same language, the poet expresses Indian sensibilities. Why all people of the world are not following Mahatma Gandhi, I am simply not understanding. Ancient Indian wisdom is 100% correct. I should say even 200% correct, something like this. So, the poem goes on to describe it. So, from Nissim Ezekiel, of course, now we go on to Arun Kolatkar, and now the time has come for us to define why we call it the Bombay Circle. But before that, we need to know one more thing. If there are two cities that stand out in Indian English poetry, in the literary map of Indian English poetry, they are Kolkata or Calcutta and Bombay. If of course Kolkata is we call it Kolkata now, then it was Calcutta. The first phase of Indian English poetry, happened in Kolkata. Therefore, Kolkata plays a major role in the early part of Indian English poetry. The origins of Indian English poetry are there. So, the roots of Indian English poetry are there. So, the flowering of Indian English poetry takes place in Bombay, especially after 1950s. In fact, including Nissim Ezekiel or beginning with Nissim Ezekiel, Bombay plays a major role in taking up Indian English poetry and establishing it as a major field of literary inquiry and all that. Therefore, in this class we are going to ask some critical questions as why do you want to call it a Bombay Circle of Poets, or who were some of the major figures in Bombay Circle of Poetry, how did these poets negotiate their identities in the backdrop of Bombay, and all these things. Yeah, here is a very beautiful poem that talks of Bombay Circle and major figures in Bombay Circle of Poetry. It's by Arvind Mehrotra, who himself is a part of the circle. As others go their ways, we came ours in 60s Bombay and stuck together through thick and thin. The times evened out. The one who died was the reviving sort and soon revived. Would the same fate await us three? Would the same fate await us three? Adil and Give and me, the ones who survive. So, here this poem identifies four major poets. Of course, the one who survived, he is not named, but of course they are referring to Arun Kolatkar here. Arun Kolatkar, and then Adil Jusawala and Give Patel, of course Arvind Mehrotra. These are the four major poets, and the poem here does not refer just to these four poets. Using these poets, using these four poets, the poem talks about how Bombay acts as a kind of a literary plexus during the 60s and until or through the 80s, beginning with the 50s through the 80s, Bombay acts as a kind of a literary plexus, drawing talent from across India and producing its own brand of modernism, especially in poetry. Okay. These were experimental poets who gathered in the 1960s in Bombay. It's not that when we say Bombay, it's not a space that's confined to a particular locale on the map. It's more of, as it's said, it's more of a sensibility. In fact, this place comes to represent certain metropolitan sensibilities, certain metropolitan values, that poets began practicing during these times. Okay. What is significant here is these three or these four poets that we discussed just a while ago. They publish, in order to publish their poetry and also to encourage other poets, they set up a publishing house called, Clearing House. This publishing house provides or it provided an extraordinary opportunity for the younger or the later poets, and they found their voice through this publishing house. These poets, that's why it is said that these poets gave voice to an unrepresented generation, to countless identities in flux, and to their enigmatic Bombay, which was rapidly changing. So, this changing, the word changing does not just signify Bombay. Of course, Bombay was changing, so were other places, so were the other cities in India. So, not just the four people, the four poets were changing, so were the other poets, so were the other masses. So, the change is the identifying word in this statement. As we have already said, Bombay acted as a kind of a literary capital, especially in the 60s, though it begins with Nissim Ezekiel 1952. Almost it was there until the 1980s. So we have some remarkable observations by well-known poets, fellow poets, and critics. City of poets and cafes, a place to rival Joyce's Dublin and Cavafy's Alexandria or Pessoa's Lisbon. Like, of course, Joyce, when you read James Joyce, we come across Dublin. In fact, Dublin comes alive through the writings of James Joyce. Dublin comes alive. Similarly, through the writings of these poets, Bombay comes alive. Now, look at what Adil Jusawala says. He says, feeling of tremendous artistic potential gathering together in one place, and the pleasurable feeling that Bombay was the place where it found a great release, something like this. And in fact, Arvind Krishna Mehrotra spent most of his life in Allahabad, So, technically it is not that he was born in Bombay. Nevertheless, he identified himself in the Bombay circle. In fact, he has always maintained this, that Bombay is a kind of an identifying mark for him. It defines him more than any other city. Bombay defines him. That's why we said that Bombay is more than a city marked between between certain points of longitude and latitude. Bombay becomes a node, a geographical plexus through which multiple and exciting trajectories of art, culture, poetry, they traverse different places and come back here. It becomes more like a node. That's why the second phase of Indian English poetry, you can if there is one place that is synonymous with the second phase of Indian English poetry, you can call it Bombay. Yeah, these were the four major poets. Of course, Adil Jusawala is also there. Arun Kolatkar, Arvind Mehrotra, Giv Patel, Dilip Chitre, Vilas Sarang, and when it comes to Marathi writers, you have Balchandra Nemade, Dasal. So, it was a healthy mix. There was a kind of a confluence of artistic voices, confluence of different traditions, creating a kind of hybrid production in Bombay, and these poets played an important role there. And in fact, most of these writers were bilingual writers. Of course, Arun Kolatkar is also known for his contribution to Marathi poetry. Dilip Chitre is an equally competent writer in both the languages. Vilas Sarang too. And Arun Kolatkar plays a major role. If there is one poet who acts as a kind of a patron to Bombay circle of poetry, it's Arun Kolatkar. So, in terms of he was the greatest ever poet, not just in India, probably anywhere across the world. So, if you look at his poetry, if you have read any of his poems, you understand why I call him one of the greatest poets ever lived. So, in fact, his significant contribution to poetry is Jejuri. In fact, it's his first contribution to poetry, Jejuri. Within just a couple of years after its publication, Jejuri goes on to win one of the most prestigious prizes dedicated for poetry, Commonwealth Writers Prize in 1977. That's the first Indian to have ever won the Commonwealth Writers Prize, Jejuri. And we are going to discuss Jejuri in a short while. We are going to take up some interesting poems there and discuss Jejuri in a short while. And his Marathi collection, Bijki Wahi, won the Sahitya Academy Award in 2005. Again, a significant contribution of Kolatkar lies there. Amit Chaudhary, a fellow writer and a literary critic, considers Jejuri and Arun Kolatkar as not just significant poetry collection or poet. He says, he goes on to the extent of calling them as a starting point for a new lineage of writing. Generally, Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children is said to have inaugurated or evinced interest, the global interest in Indian English literature, especially Indian English fiction. But much before Rushdie's Midnight's Children was there, Jejuri was there. Of course, though Jejuri is, it's in poetry, Midnight's Children is fiction, the contribution of Jejuri is no less significant. Probably you can even say that it's much more than what Midnight's Children is to fiction. Jejuri is to Indian English poetry. Therefore, a perceptive reader might even be able to trace another lineage of Indian English poetry from Jejuri onwards. That's why Jejuri plays a very significant role. And again, Kolatkar, to know a little bit more about Kolatkar. Kolatkar was considered a bohemian writer, so he was a Bombay bohemian. He was a maverick writer, an iconoclastic writer, an unconventional writer. He found his living through advertising. In fact, he was a major figure in the field of advertising. Therefore, he did not depend on writing for his survival, unlike many poets. Therefore, he had an extraordinary insight into, he was considered a kind of a visualizer. So, not just in the field of advertising, if you look at his poetry, you find the visual element predominantly in his poetry. So, his words are capable of evoking a picture, a mental picture. Therefore, he was a great visualizer. And he was a healthy mix of great regional traditions and Western literary traditions. He was not, of course, while he was open to the influences of egalitarian regional traditions, especially the Bhakti traditions of India, he was equally open to the Western influences. Therefore, you can find in his poetry an extraordinary confluence of Eastern and Western influences. Yeah, Jejuri we have already identified as a new lineage of Indian English literature begins, especially poetry begins with this particular collection. And Ghoda poems, of course, is another milestone. That says another collection. Interestingly, after Jejuri, Kolatkar does not publish any other collection, though it went on to win Commonwealth Writers Prize. He did not publish for a significant reason. It's not that he wasn't writing poetry. On the other hand, he was busy writing poetry, but he chose not to publish anything in a systematic way or in the form of a collection. So therefore you find Kala Ghoda poems having appeared almost after a couple of decades, an extraordinary work. And Sarpasatra too is another important contribution. In fact, every serious student of poetry or every serious student of literature, I would go on to the extreme, to the extent of saying that, they must read Sarpasatra for its extraordinary use of language and for its wonderful retelling of the Mahabharata, and it has an extraordinary poetic, it's highly significant work, a kind of a poetic meditation on violence and human nature. It keeping the frame narrative of Mahabharata, Janamejaya's sacrifice. In fact, Sarpasatra is a snake sacrifice. Keeping that in mind, he goes on to discuss some extraordinary things. A beautiful collection. Beautiful. It's almost epic in its own right. This particular poem, a long poem, it has achieved the status of an epic, a short epic. Here are a couple of poems from Jejuri. Again, to give you an idea of the poetic genius. Please remember, there is a kind of a misconception about Arun Kolatkar. In fact, Arun Kolatkar is misconstrued as an irreligious writer, an irreligious writer. He is not a religious writer. Whereas, if you look carefully deep down, you understand that, he revives the vibrant Bhakti tradition of poetry that existed in India or that exists in India, especially in Bhasha literatures. He revives that tradition in English. In fact, if there is one writer, Indian English writer, who plays a major role in reviving the Bhakti tradition of literature, then it is none other than our Arun Kolatkar. Though at the surface they may sound sacrilegious or outrageous, if you look deep down, they are highly spiritual poems. He is one of the greatest spiritual poets that you can come across, especially Chaitanya. Now look at that particular poem, just a short one. Chaitanya, I am sure Chaitanya needs no introduction to any Indian who is aware of, especially at least who is a little exposed to Bhakti tradition, a major Vaishnavite follower of Krishna, Chaitanya. So, sweet as grapes are the stones of Jejuri, saying that he popped a stone in his mouth and spat out gods. Now look at this. Any reader who is not careful, any careless reader may easily misconstrue it as a highly irreligious work, or some kind of they may be under shock. But look at this. In fact, the poem discusses the spirit of Bhakti tradition in an extraordinary way. In fact, look what happens here. In fact, rather than considering God as some kind of an idol or as some kind of spirit residing in an ideal, he goes on to call Chaitanya as that kind of a spirit which is capable of producing the divine element. So anything that Chaitanya touches, anything the great devotee Chaitanya touches becomes God. So what creates God? It's the devotion. What gives birth to God? It's the devotion that gives birth to God. So therefore, devotee comes to occupy a greatest pedestal than the God himself, than the deity. It's the devotee that gives birth to a deity. Now think of it. Think of this particular statement, and you will understand how great a poet Arun Kolatkar is. Of course, I am not exhausting the meaning of the poem. I am just making you, I am drawing your attention towards it. Now look at another poem from the same collection, Scratch. What is God and what is stone? The dividing line, if it exists, is very thin at Jejuri. Now isn't this what our Upanishads say? what our Bhagavad Gita say, the Spirit of God resides in all things, whether it is living or non-living. In Chara-chara, God exists in Chara-chara, So, a great mind, see, if it comes to that, even a linga is also a stone. So, a true devotee need not find a linga, to express his devotion. Wherever he or she turns around, they may find a linga in any stone. Therefore, you can't find a kind of, you can't distinguish between, what is a sacred stone, what is not a sacred stone, right? It's there in the way you consider that, it's the way. So, therefore, especially in Jejuri, he says that the dividing line does not exist. Everything becomes godly there, everything becomes divine, because anything that devotee touches with a pure heart becomes an element to seek the divinity, element to seek out the divinity. So, and every other stone is God or his cousin, something like this. Now, beautifully, scratch a rock and a legend springs. Isn't this a beautiful way of expressing how we are a mythological nation, a nation obsessed with legends, mythologies and things like that, because these are called Sthala Puranas. If you go to any village, any place, people will show you towards a temple or a small place of worship, and they say, they give you a story behind that, a story why that place is being called by a particular name. There is a story behind that. That's how a legend springs. Scratch a rock and a legend springs. And another brilliant poem here, of course, The Butterfly. An extraordinary poem, again a short poem, a brilliant poem. And the butterfly itself is highly symbolic. In fact, the butterfly plays a very major role. It's a very potent metaphor, even in the writings of many major writers. Of course, even in 100 Years of Solitude, you can recall, butterflies play a very major role for Marquez. There is no story behind it. It is split like a second. It hinges around itself. It has no future. It is pinned down to no past. It is a pun on the present. In fact, we have discussed various literary elements in one of our earlier classes. Please recall what a pun means and see present. The pun is intended here. Present has two meanings. One is a gift and the other is, the present time. So, how the poet says the butterfly, comes to symbolize something that is ephemeral. Of course, the entire human life is ephemeral, right? So, the butterfly stands for that ephemerality that life signifies, and therefore to focus more on the present rather than obsessing ourselves over what will happen to us, and rather than brooding about what happened to us. If we can focus on the present, then that's the greatest present we can give to ourselves, something like this. And the butterfly signifies all that. Now, it's a little yellow butterfly. It has taken these wretched hills under its wings. When it flies, not just the wretched hills, it seems it has taken an entire globe under its wings. Just a pinch of yellow. It opens before it closes, and it closes before it. Oh, where is it? Now look at what happens here. I mean, this is what is called scansion, the art of reading poetry in a proper way. When you read it, I have always highlighted this, that it's at the magic touch of your voice that a poem comes alive from the frozen pages in which it is published. It comes alive only at the magical touch of your voice. Now look what happens here. Look how elegantly the poet introduces the element of epiphany, how poetry is capable of creating epiphany here. Epiphany is, an extraordinary revelation that happens all of a sudden, a moment of epiphany, epiphanic moment, how poetry achieves it. Now look at this. When you read it, you will realize the moment of epiphany, Throughout, the poet is talking of ephemerality, the transience of life, and using the metaphor of butterfly, is discussing how it is pinned to no past, how it has no future, and how it lives in the present. And look what happens. As the poet is speaking about it, the butterfly has disappeared. Just a pinch of yellow, it opens before it closes, and it closes before it he doesn't even finish the word opens, and it closes before it, oh, where is it? Look at how beautifully the poem gives us a moment of epiphany. That's the reason why I call this particular class Arun Kolatkar and his Bombay Circle, because he played an extraordinary role in shaping the literary sensibilities of his entire generation and even his subsequent generation. Okay. So, in the next class, let us take up some more major Indian English poets and their contribution to the field. Until then, take care.